In this episode, we talk about how a Supreme Court appointed committee is planning to save the critically endangered Great Indian Bustard. We also discuss US President Donald Trump's announcement of a 25% tariff on Indian goods. But we begin today by turning to the skies and talking about a first of its kind Earth observation satellite. Hi, I'm Ichha Sharma, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. On Wednesday, India's premier space agency, ISRO, successfully launched an Earth observation satellite called NISAR. Now, as many of you might know, Earth observation satellites are fairly common. In fact, there are hundreds of them currently orbiting the planet. But the reason we are talking about this particular one is because it's actually the most powerful Earth observation satellite in space right now, and was built in collaboration with NASA. It's worth noting that this marks the first time that NASA and ISRO have come together to develop a satellite, a milestone in the growing partnership between the two space agencies. So to know more about this collaboration and what sets this satellite apart, my colleague Shashank Bhargava speaks to the Indian Express's Amitabh Sinha.
Amitabh, tell us what makes this satellite unique. What sets it apart from others that are in space right now?
Right. So from ISRO's perspective, it is probably the most significant launch since Chandrayaan-3, the moon landing mission. It has launched satellites in between. Satellites, as you say, are regularly launched, not just by India, but countries across the world. That's not a big deal. But this particular satellite is quite special. It's special for a lot of reasons. One, it is a satellite that has been developed by India and US, basically ISRO and NASA, through a joint development. And it's the first time that such a thing has happened. The first time that the two space agencies have collaborated on a hardware project. Half of the development has happened in the US, half of it in India. So that is something unique that has happened for the first time. So that is one special part. But beyond this, the satellite itself is very special.
Yeah, we understand that it has two SARs, which stands for synthetic aperture radars. And this will allow it to take some really high quality images. So tell our listeners what these SARs are.
Yes. So SARs are, the name has a radar in it, synthetic aperture radar. So one can imagine the kind of radars that we are used to seeing on ground, huge dish antennas, which are meant to transmit and then collect the signals coming back from, bouncing off from objects. And then based on the analysis of the incoming sort of bounced off radiation, they decipher a lot of information about the objects that they have bounced off from. So that's what basically a radar does. SARs themselves are not very rare. There are lots of SARs that are already in space.
Right, but this one has two of them.
Yes, this has two of them. And as I said, any radar tries to decipher information from radiation that are bounced off from an object, and gleaning that information or analyzing that information, it can also produce images. Now, we are used to taking images from cameras, which are like optical images, but there are other ways of producing a picture using non-visible electromagnetic radiation. So, instead of throwing light, you throw electromagnetic radiation of other wavelengths, and they are very similar in nature to light, just that they are not visible to our eyes, so they can be used to create imagery as well. And this is what SARs will do. As you said, the unique thing about this one is that it carries two SARs, two synthetic aperture radars, something that has never been done before.
And Amitabh, because this satellite has two SARs, tell us how high quality will its images be?
Yes. So the reason why we are putting two SARs is both of them are different frequencies, and both of them would do a sort of complementary sort of imaging of the same subject, and they would capture the subject in different kind of details, right? So like one of them is more adept looking at the larger features, for example. They can capture the tree cover very well. They won't be able to penetrate the tree cover to see the ground, right? But they would be able to map the tree cover very, very well. The other synthetic aperture radar, the frequency range that operates in, their signals would be able to penetrate the tree and go and see what is on the ground below the tree. And then what happens is the image, the information that you have is how does the larger feature look like? So how does the forest look like? And then how does the ground beneath the forest also look like?
And are we saying that we are not able to take these kind of images right now? Or are we saying that we are not able to take these kind of images from one satellite?
Yeah, we are not able to take it from the one satellite. So you can theoretically argue that, okay, so what's the big deal? You can have two satellites, one in this frequency range, the other in the other frequency range, and capture the images. And then, it's fairly, should be routine to, put the data together and get the information out. Now, the problem with that is that those two satellites would come over that one particular area at different points of time, not the same time, right? And this time lag is important because, something might have changed during that time. In fact, one of the main reasons for this, putting these two SARs together on the same satellite, is to observe the changes that are happening. So you can observe the change that is happening at the top of the tree and then also go down and see what is happening beneath the tree. So both the things is happening at the same time. If you're doing it with two different things, one, there would be a time lag. Probably they are not optimized to look at exactly the same place. The time lag would have a different set of challenges, but also they are not coordinated to work together. The data would be slightly different. It'll be optimized differently. And there are lots of challenges in, putting that data together and gleaning that information. It can be done, but it won't be qualitatively, it won't be as good as this one is supposed to do, right? So they are meant to work together, meant to complement each other, and meant to sort of strengthen each other's capabilities. They are designed to work in this particular way.
And Amitabh, what would be the typical applications of this? And also, what did ISRO and NASA have in mind while building this? Because we understand that it also took over a decade and a half to build.
So it was designed to do two or three things. One, it was meant to observe climate change parameters, right? So how are the forests changing? How are the water bodies changing? And as I said, it is able to capture the change. So it'll be like passing over the same site repeatedly after a few days. And therefore, it is able to capture what is happening. So climate change was one of the major things. As you mentioned, this was designed 10, 15 years ago. In fact, the original concept for this kind of a satellite that came, I think, way back in 2008 or something, 2007, 2008 time frame. And at that point of time, climate change was becoming very big, and we really needed to observe the phenomena happening on the Earth very, very closely to collect as much data as possible. So this is one of the prime objectives. The other major objective was to look at land processes and how things are changing, and this from the perspective of disasters. So looking at the processes that trigger landslides, for example, the processes that trigger volcanoes, the processes that trigger earthquakes.
Right, and we are talking on a day when Russia has witnessed a 8.8 magnitude earthquake. And this is something we've talked about in the past as well, that earthquakes, for example, you can't predict them.
You can't predict earthquakes. You can't even predict landslides, for example, but there's a lot of research happening in trying to capture the predictors for earthquakes, for example. And so one of the objectives for this satellite was also those kind of things, to collect more data to facilitate research on earthquake early warning system, for example. Basically, to watch all the processes happening on Earth in very minute detail, minute as in, capturing change over 1 centimeter of area. So that minute, actually, that much in detail. And then once you have that kind of very high resolution data over 1 centimeter, it then goes on to facilitate a whole range of activities, a whole range of research, and also a whole range of applications. That data can be straight away taken and used for different kind of applications. Urban planning, for example, can be one. Forestry management can be other. And a whole cropping patterns, whole range of things that can be done with that. So it's going to generate a huge amount of data, more than any other satellite has done in the past. So another one of the special things about this satellite, it's also perhaps the costliest satellite ever, costing more than $1.2 billion.
Wait, how much does a satellite typically cost?
Well, it depends on what the size of the satellite, also where you want to place it and for what purpose and what the kind of payloads that are there. But certainly not in billions of dollars. The easy satellites, sometimes the students send satellites as CubeSats and all the small ones. They would cost sometimes just a few thousands of rupees. A lot of them would cost, any meaningful satellite will obviously cost much more, but certainly not, anywhere in the range of billions of dollars. This is certainly one of the most expensive ones that way.
And Amitabh, we've talked about how this satellite has these two SARs, right? So talk about what were the challenges in putting this together, because this is the first time this is being done. So what kind of hurdles did these space agencies had to overcome?
So, very simply, we have sent so many big satellites are there. We've sent so much in space. So what's the huge big deal about putting two SARs on the same satellite? The challenge really is that both these SARs work on similar technologies and would be sending out similar kind of signals that has to come back without interfering with, signals interfere with each other. That's one of the reasons why on a flight you are asked to switch off your mobile phones, isn't it? Or when the radars where they are placed, most of these are placed in locations slightly away from population. So to reduce the noise, right? And there is so much of, signals, especially with the onset of mobile phones. There's so much happening in the sky that there's a lot of noise that is generated. So radars and the telescopes that study the universe, stars and everything, they tend to be located at places which are slightly noise free. Now you have two SARs located side by side or together in space, and there is a huge problem of one signal interfering with the other and therefore corrupting the data that you are getting. So getting them to work together in tandem with one antenna, capturing the signals and then complementing each other in a synchronized fashion, that was a huge engineering challenge. And that was one of the reasons why it has taken so many years to build this satellite and make it work efficiently.
And Amitabh, we mentioned earlier that this is the first time that ISRO and NASA have collaborated on building a satellite. Tell us, what does it signal about our relationship with the US in the space sector?
So this is also a very important part of this. In fact, the NASA-ISRO collaboration on NISAR project, that started much earlier than the recent very strategic partnership that the two agencies have got into. But actually, this is just a sort of a starter for the kind of things that the two agencies plan to do together in future. In 2023, when Prime Minister Modi had gone to Washington, on a state visit. At that time, President Biden used to be in office. Their joint statement actually talked about a strategic partnership in the space sector. Both NASA and ISRO, they signed an agreement to coordinate much closely on space activities. One of the results of that agreement is what we saw last month in the context of Subhanshu Shukla actually going on a trip to the International Space Station. It was, of course, on a private mission. Axiom 4 is a private space company and it was a private mission. And ISRO actually, participated, paid for to go on that trip to send Subhanshu Shukla on that trip. But that trip was facilitated by NASA. And immediately after that agreement, there's something even more significant happened, which is India signed on to what are known as the Artemis Accords. So Artemis Accords are a set of, sort of principles for good behavior in space. And it is a US-led initiative. Actually, US has set out or listed a few things that countries should or should not do in space for peaceful exploitation of space, for peaceful purposes. And so India signed on to that. In the space sector, it would be seen as sort of India joining the US camp, sort of, right?
And I mean, just from the historical perspective, we've come a long way, because there was a time when the US, it wasn't willing to help India when it was starting its space program.
Exactly. In fact, good that you point that out. In fact, in the 90s, and that's a very well documented case, that one US denied technology to India, specifically on the cryogenic engines, the cryogenic technology. India had signed a deal with Russia for the supply of cryogenic engines and also for technology transfer, which US blocked using an international technology regime called MTCR, Missile Technology Control Regime. So US had blocked that technology transfer. India's space program actually got delayed because of that technology denial. And the irony is that the NISAR spacecraft, the NISAR mission, which flew today, it flew on a GSLV rocket which had an Indian-made, indigenously developed cryogenic engine, which was powering it. So you're right, we have come a long way from there. And the reason Artemis Accords become important is that two of the other major space powers, so China and Russia, they are not part of the Artemis Accords. So they are sort of seen in a different camp. So you have the four of the biggest space powers, and you would have to count India in that. So you have US, India, China, Russia, that ways. These are not formal camps, not as in the kind of Cold War camps that we have seen, but still India signing the Artemis Accords is quite significant, because what it signals is that in future, India and US would be doing a lot together in collaboration, at least as far as the space sector is concerned.
And next, we come back to Earth and turn to a development that sits at the crossroads of conservation and clean energy. Recently, a Supreme Court appointed committee submitted its long-awaited recommendations on how India can protect one of its most critically endangered species, the Great Indian Bustard, without derailing its renewable energy ambitions.
So the Great Indian Bustard is a large terrestrial bird which is primarily found in dry grassland areas of the country.
This is the Indian Express's Nikhil Ghanekar, who reported on the story for the newspaper.
And historically, it was distributed across the western, central and southern parts of India. Unfortunately, its present population is below 140 individuals, and it is largely concentrated in Rajasthan, where about 120 to 130 individuals reportedly are present. In Gujarat, there are some individuals, and reports of some individuals of bustards found in Maharashtra, Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh. Now, the issue with the bustard has been that over many decades, its historical range and its population have both declined. And this has been attributed to hunting in the past, habitat loss due to the expansion of intensive agriculture in the grasslands, habitat degradation, development of infrastructure, mortalities due to collision with power lines, and the preying of their chicks and their eggs by other species. Now, it's a very peculiar kind of animal where the reproduction cycle is very slow. That is why any impact on its population has a short to medium term impact also.
And Nikhil says that even though the bird has a long lifespan, about 15 to 16 years, it is still susceptible to adult mortality because it breeds slowly, raising only up to one chick a year.
And that is why its population cannot bounce back very fast compared to some other species. It was tagged as critically endangered in 2011 by the International Union of Conservation of Nature and the IUCN. And it has also been added to Appendix 1 of the Convention on Migratory Species, which is an international framework on protection of species which are declining in their numbers and which need more international cooperation for reviving their population. So it has to be revived from the brink of extinction.
And so a 7-member committee was set up by the Supreme Court in March 2024 to find a practical solution to a long-standing conflict: the overlap between India's renewable energy zones and the habitat of the critically endangered Great Indian Bustard. So to understand what the committee has proposed and what it could mean going forward, we speak to Nikhil in this segment, who begins by explaining how this issue ended up before the Supreme Court in the first place.
So the issue, as far as the Supreme Court is concerned, this case was filed by former bureaucrat Mr. M.K. Ranjit Singh, and his petition was filed in June 2019. It's very simple and straightforward that the GIBs, the Great Indian Bustards and their habitat, which is confined to, in the present day, confined to the dry areas in Kutch and Thar district, This also overlaps with an area and region that has huge potential for development of renewable energy and associated infrastructure. Now, what has happened is that because this steady decline of the bird has also coincided in a way with the boom in renewable energy in the past 2 decades, the associated infrastructure such as overhead power lines, which evacuate or basically take power from the generation areas to the plants, wind farms and solar plants to the final consumer, you need to build overhead power lines and distribution networks, substations, etc. Now, the bustard being a very peculiar kind of animal, as we mentioned before, it is large. Its vision has a specific issue. It does not have the wherewithal to look above its head exactly to prevent it from colliding with obstacles. And that is where a lot of these collisions happen. To make it clear to our listeners, collisions of birds and power lines is not something specific to bustards. It happens with most bird species. It's not exclusive to bustards. But the issue is that because of their large weight and also the vision issues, which are arranged laterally on their head for providing peripheral vision, it has a different problem where it cannot avoid these linear aerial infrastructures, and hence they collide with them, they die, they get injured. Now, the issue is that with any other species, they might not have a problem because of the reproduction cycle. But as we mentioned earlier, the bustard has anyway been on a decline. And with this problem compounding the issue of their numbers and adding to their mortality, reviving their population becomes a problem because of the slow reproduction cycle.
And Nikhil, the top court appointed a 7-member expert committee in March last year. So talk a bit about what led to its formation.
So the 7-member committee, which was constituted by the Supreme Court, this relates to a past order of the Supreme Court, which was written in 2021 by a bench headed by Justice Bobde. In 2021, Justice Bobde's bench had said that over 80,000 square kilometers of area in Rajasthan and Gujarat, where the bustard finds its habitat, the power lines that pass in these areas need to be buried underground so that their mortalities is prevented. Over the years, what happened is that the government of India, through the Ministry of Power, Central Electricity Authority, and the power companies through their associations, and because their interests lie in this region for development of RE and their projects are planned, they said that this will be prohibitively costly. This will raise maintenance issues because burying underground so many kilometers of power lines, hundreds of kilometers in some sections, not all sections, will raise safety issues, will raise maintenance issues over a period of time, etc. So in 2024 March, a bench of former Chief Justice of India, Justice Chandrachud, modified that 2021 order, and it said that while the conservation of bustard is also important, we have to keep in mind that to offset the pollution and other issues caused by burning of fossil fuels for generation of electricity, we have to rely on the potential in the Western India, specifically Rajasthan and Gujarat, to develop renewable energy. And as a result, we have to also take care of those interests. Now, this 7-member expert committee was formed specifically to address and balance the issues of the bustard conservation, as well as they were given a direction to specifically recommend measures that would keep the interests of these renewable projects in consideration. That is what their task was. And along with that, they also had a few other mandates of suggesting measures for the conservation of the bustard, how their funding will be provided, etc.
Right, and we understand that the GIB habitat was originally classified into 3 zones, right? So can you tell us what they are and also how have they been revised?
So these habitats, these are zones that were identified by the Supreme Court in its 2024 order for better understanding of the issue and also to give a mandate to the authorities that these are the areas that need to be protected. Now, let's be clear that there are already a couple of protected areas, and this is a legal term that is used. Protected areas refer to national parks and sanctuaries under the Wildlife Protection Act. So we already have the Desert National Park and a sanctuary in Kutch. Now, these 3 zones that you asked about, these are not in the nature of legally protected areas, but essentially broad zonation that was done to make it easier for understanding of where the bustard's presence lies and where it needs to be protected, where it does not need protection as much because of already low numbers, etc., and areas where it has potential to grow in the future. And that is why they were categorized as and named as priority area, additional important areas, and potential areas. So that is how the zonation was done. In Rajasthan, around 13,100 square kilometer was identified as priority area. In Gujarat, 500 square kilometer was identified as priority area, and this area has been identified on the basis of scientific studies that were carried out by the Wildlife Institute of India, Dehradun, and the Forest Department of Rajasthan and Gujarat. They carried a study over the past few years prior to the Supreme Court order, and that is how they determined the areas where the bustards are using territories and areas where they can improve in terms of their numbers.
And earlier you mentioned that the committee is mandated to look for solutions on conservation of the Great Indian Bustard. So what has it recommended so far?
So in the priority area that we talked about earlier, they have said that they have suggested rather to the Supreme Court, and this is yet to be made public because the Supreme Court's hearing is on 7th of August when it will take up these recommendations. What this committee has suggested is that we should create power corridors. Now, what is a power corridor, one may wonder. Essentially, what they have suggested is that in this priority area, whatever power lines are existing, overhead power lines, in areas where we know already that the bustards, move freely, they need to be immediately on a priority basis put underground, or they need to be insulated, or they need to be rerouted through this corridor. Now, this corridor essentially will be like a stretch of 4 to 5 kilometers of width in Rajasthan. And in Gujarat, it will be of a width of 1 to 2 kilometers as per the recommendation. And that corridor will be used to, reroute the power lines so that it does not form crisscrossing maze of network and hamper the flight of bustards. And in this also, they have said that not all lines should be put underground or not all lines should be rerouted. They have given specific recommendations based on the area involved. Secondly, they have said or suggested to the Supreme Court rather that there should be certain conservation measures, such as Rajasthan, which has a larger bustard population, they should give the bustard eggs to Gujarat so that a jumpstart method can be used. A jumpstart method is basically where incubation of already laid eggs is done in the wild and sometimes in situ or in conservation breeding centers also. Another important recommendation that was made by this committee is that they said there can be no blanket restrictions on the existing power lines. However, outside, we are talking about in the priority areas, and outside the priority areas, there will be no blanket restrictions at all. Blanket restrictions, although, have been put on new solar parks or wind parks in these priority areas where bustards are found, and expansion of older, smaller solar plants and wind farms will not be allowed either.
And finally, we talk about the US's reciprocal tariffs. On Wednesday, US President Donald Trump announced that Indian goods would face a 25% tariff, along with an additional penalty tied to India's defense and energy imports from Russia. The announcement first appeared on Trump's Truth Social account and was later repeated during a White House press interaction. Trump said that India's tariffs on US products were far too high and accused the country of having the most strenuous and obnoxious non-monetary trade barriers of any country. He also criticized India's partnership in the BRICS bloc, calling it an attack on the dollar. As the Indian Express's Siddharth Upasni reports, the 25% tariff is part of a broader set of measures which were expected to kick in ahead of 1st of August deadline. He also writes that according to most economists, these tariffs could drag India's growth down to below 6% in the current financial year. Meanwhile, India's Ministry of Commerce and Industry has said it is reviewing the implications of the announcement. In a statement, the ministry reaffirmed India's commitment to a fair and balanced trade deal, while also emphasizing that it would safeguard the interests of farmers, MSMEs, and entrepreneurs. Now, Trump also justified the move by pointing to India's growing imports of Russian oil and military equipment. Since the start of the Ukraine war in 2022, India's crude oil imports from Russia have gone from under 1% to around 35 to 40% of its total crude intake, making it the second largest buyer of Russian oil after China. White House economic advisor Kevin Hassett told reporters that Trump had grown frustrated with the pace of talks with India and believed that announcing tariffs would push negotiations forward. This additional penalty over Russian imports marks the first time the US has openly linked secondary tariffs to trade with Russia. You were listening to Three Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and produced by Shashank Bhargava and me, Ichha Sharma. If you like the show, do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast. You can also recommend it to someone you think may like it, with a friend or in your family. This is the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Podcast or write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.